research. Because, we have biases. We start from biases. We start from questions which are inevitably anachronistic, rooted in the present. But then it's possible to learn something from the actors' voices, from the evidence, and so correcting our initial biases and then establishing a dialogue which is potentially endless. Now, history and fiction. Certainly, my questions were certainly affected by fiction. I've been an avid reader of novels. I read probably the novel which most deeply affected me has been Tolstoy's War and Peace. I read War and Peace in a translation which had been revised by my father when he was in internal exile. And so my father died. I was probably 10, a child, and I read for the first time War and Peace, and I understood very little of it. But then I read it again and again along the years. And I think that, let's say, even that book on Menocchio had been affected by my reading of War and Peace, insofar as Tolstoy said, for instance, this is at the very core of his novel, in order to have an appropriate account of a battle, we should reconstruct the lives of all people involved in it, not only, let's say, generals, but also the humblest soldiers. So I think that, let's say, there was in my attitude in reading those inquisitorial trials, fiction as well. And I think that, let's say, my earliest books, The Night Battles and the Cheese and the Worms, had a dimension, a narrative dimension, which could be taken as close to fiction, but. Now, the but became crucial, not only for me. I was deeply aware that I was dealing with evidence, but it became that but crucial later, when in the late 70s and early 80s, I was confronted with a completely different intellectual atmosphere in which there were scholars, writers, arguing that there was no clear cut between fictional narratives and historical narratives. Everything was fiction. Everything was rhetoric. I strongly reacted against this for decades, but. First of all, I started from the hypothesis that along centuries and millennia, fiction, different kinds of fiction, and history, different kind of history, were involved in a competition and in a contentious dialogue, sometimes contentious dialogue, in order to represent reality. And I would say reality without quotation marks. So there has been this back and forth of devices, for instance. I've been explored some of them. And then, there was a kind of bifurcation concerning the strategy to be used in order to fight against this neo-skeptical attitude, which I thought had dangerous moral, political, and cognitive implications. This was a long time before the spread of fake news. But today, I argue that, let's say, the success, the impact of fake news had been also prepared by this poisonous intellectual atmosphere against which I've been fighting for decades. As soon as I realized, when I started to teach at UCLA, that the most brilliant students were fascinated by this neo-skeptical attitude. So there was a bifurcation, a potential bifurcation. And here again, I would like to quote Gramsci because it came to my mind. He talked about, but he was talking about something completely different, not about, let's say, fictional and historical narratives. He was talking about the future of revolution in the West, in Western Europe. And he said, okay, there are, let's say, two possible strategies. Guerra di posizione e guerra di movimento. So trenches or a war based on an aggressive strategy. Digging trenches, what did it mean in my metaphorical perspective? To say to the neo-skeptics, fictional narratives are fictional narratives. Historical narratives are historical narratives. Fiction is fiction, truth is truth. So this was like digging a trench and staying there. This was not effective. I thought that this was the wrong strategy. A different strategy had been used, should have been used. An aggressive strategy. And I realized the potential of this aggressive strategy when I was invited to give a series of lectures in Jerusalem in the early 90s. And I gave as a title of my lectures, which later became the title of a book, History, Rhetoric, and Proof. Now, the crucial word in this, I mean, there was a provocation in the idea of proof, because this sounded like a sort of homage to positivism. But then there was rhetoric. And I mean, when I was preparing those lectures, I realized that actually there are two traditions of rhetoric in the Western tradition. One goes back to Aristotle, then has been reworked by Quintilian, then reworked by Lorenzo Valla, for instance. In that tradition, proofs are crucial. Aristotle, in his rhetoric, has a detailed description and analysis of different kinds of proof. The other tradition, starting from Nietzsche and Nietzsche's followers, is completely different. In fact, opposite. In that tradition, rhetoric is opposed to proof. Now, what I said, what I argued for in my lectures was that we historians have to rely upon the Aristotelian, Quintilian, Vallian tradition, which implies the possibility of arguing and demonstrating that the so-called donation of Constantine, in which, according to a tradition, a document which says that Constantine, the Roman emperor, before dying, gave the third of the empire to the church, to the Christian church. Now, Valla, in the 15th century, demonstrated that this document was a forgery. If we are unable to demonstrate that the pseudo-diaries of Hitler are a forgery, if you are unable to demonstrate that a fake news is a fake news, we are lost. We are lost, not only as historians, but as citizens and as human beings. So, archive. Should I go on? No, I have to stop.
No, it's interesting because I was going to lead into something that you actually led me to, which is anger and rage. You know, the fact that, I mean, how does the historian train, discipline, control rage and anger in these very dark times, right, at one level, not only with the injustice of the times, but from within the academy, where prejudice and bias must be coming into play, anger, therefore, at one-sided scholarship, or what we often label as distortion, versus the objective insofar as one can be when faced with the starkness of histories of extreme atrocities, for example. Also, the notion of what I see as the distortion of the archive versus the idea of detection, Sherlock Holmes. As in when you talk about your Jewish identity being largely the result of persecution, how then do you work your way as a detective historian through the distortion by the perpetrators, who were also meticulous chroniclers of their own versions of the persecution?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I see the implications of what you say, and this is very important. You know, I think that, let's say, anger certainly can inspire our questions. I think that in the demonstration, the anger must be controlled, because otherwise our target could react saying, but you are too emotional and so on. So I think there are ways of controlling, and this is part of, it's an element of writing. We haven't spoken about writing so far, but I think that writing can imply, let's say, kind of controlled anger, which would be very effective if it would be based on an effective demonstration. So I think that, let's say, and here I'm, let's say, in a way, referring to Karl Popper's argument, I think that the aim of our demonstration, which is potentially refutable, because otherwise, as Popper argued, it would not be related to a scientific perspective. So our demonstration is potentially refutable, but I think the aim would be to transfer the burden of proof on our opponents. This is the aim. And this is potentially possible, or let's say reachable, through an effective use of the evidence, constructing an argument which would be convincing enough, but potentially refutable.
And what may we learn from the, what I'd like to call, unreliable archives or documents that are simply, even cleverly revealed to hide the truth, therefore largely untrue? After all, one needs to dig between the lines to reveal attitudes and circumstances of what we may label the victim's truth. How does one do this? As you yourself have often said and talked about, the ambivalence of identity, the dilemma of being both on the side of the victim at the level of emotion.
Yeah, actually, I realized this ambivalence quite late in my research, because first of all, there was this, let's say, commitment to an attempt to rescue the voices and the attitudes of the victims. And as I realized after many, many years, after having published even the book, The Cheese and the Worms, I realized that my, let's say, recollections of my childhood, when I was close to the, in the very center of the German retreat, and there were Germans, we were surrounded by Germans, and I was with my mother and my maternal grandmother, and my maternal grandmother was the only non-Jewish member in my family, said to me, if they would ask you, what's your name? I was 5. You should say, my name is Carlo Tanzi. Actually, Tanzi, who is not a Jewish name, was the name of her father. Now, later on, I realized that at that moment, I became Jewish. At that moment. Because I was aware, this remained in my mind as a kind of a double identity. So there was another identity, and actually my grandmother wrote my false name, Carlo Tanzi, on the front page of a book I was being read at the moment. Actually, I was reading also because I'd learned to read. So, at that moment, I became Jewish. Actually, a friend of mine who was working responsible for the cultural program at the New York Public Library Paul Holdengraber, a close friend, asked me to contribute to a program on Jewishness. And I sent a title for our interview, Being Jewish, Becoming Jewish. I became Jewish at that moment. In that sense, I mean, my, let's say, awareness was the result of persecution. And, okay, so your question is, what can we do with, let's say, pieces of evidence which are basically untrue? I've been asked a few months ago, I was in Latin America, and I've been invited to participate in a conference on, the title was, there were several words, and one of the words was post-truth. So I decided to speak about fake news, of course. But I started saying that two of the most powerful books of history published in the 20th century